Hello again, this is Dr. Robert Guthrie. We're back together again with a continuation of our scholarly study of the New Testament, which is descended from the Sunday school class we used to have at Jerome United Methodist Church here in Dublin before the pandemic hit. And it's a pleasure to have you back. I appreciate people who take the time to listen to this. I've had some people comment that they miss the ambiance of the fireplace in the background, but it's here at the end of July, it's beastly hot in Ohio, so I'm not going to burn up energy to put a little ambience there. And one person liked to see my cat wandering through, but if you know cats, they wander when they want to and where they want to, so don't know whether she's going to come by again or not, but that's up to her. We're doing 1 Peter, and it's an interesting letter. Not that there's a lot of original theology in it, there is some. But it's an interesting letter to date and to try to place in the context. If it did come from the Apostle Peter, then that's quite an accomplishment that this Galilean fisherman, who was an original witness to Jesus' ministry, was with him all the time, was with him at the Transfiguration, was with him at the arrest, was with him at the crucifixion, saw him again at Pentecost, and when he appeared in the Sea of Galilee. So it'll be quite a first-person account of the miraculous resurrection of Jesus and the salvation that comes to it. But it's challenging a bit to place. It's a very ancient letter. So the Christian community of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, which is when the Bible the New Testament came together, they've always regarded it as authentic. There's a suggestion that Clement of Rome, who was the first pope after the death of Peter and Paul, some suggestion, not a clear statement that he was familiar with it. Several of the other Christian writers of the 2nd century, Polycarp and Irenaeus, both referenced it in the mid-2nd century. So it was well known in the Christian community. So it's probably very ancient, even back to the time where Peter may have been alive. If Peter was the source, he died in either 64 or 67. The traditional date has been 64. Some people say 67. Under the persecutions under Nero, he was crucified as a non-Roman citizen, and apparently buried right underneath where the altar in the Vatican in St. Peter's Basilica is. The altar is right on top of a 1st century gravesite with Christian graffiti around it. I tried to get them to let me go down there, and they were not interested in that. So he very well may have ended up in Rome. It's an odd thing about Peter because he's a major participant in the first part of Acts, of course. And then when Paul appears and kind of takes over, he drops out of the narrative. So we don't know what he did after the beginning of Paul's major ministry, about 50 to 53, and apparently ends up in Rome, which is where he writes or dictates this letter, and has his death there in the mid-60s of the 1st century. It's unlikely that he actually wrote this. He doesn't even claim to write that. He had a scribe named Silvanus. Now, there was also a scribe companion of Paul named Silvanus, so it's probably the same person who went back and forth or knew them both, because they both came to their end in about that same time frame. It's written in a solid workmanlike Greek, not the flowering, elegant Greek of James and Hebrews. So it's unlikely that Peter actually wrote it. I'm not certain he could even read and write himself. He was a Galilean fisherman. But he had an adequate scribe, and he could dictate it or give him the ideas, and the scribe would present it. So it very well may go back to the 1st century. There are some scholars who've looked at the references that are in there in several places in the letter to the difficult times now and to come, and say, well, that may backdate it a little. I mean, move it forward a little bit, because the persecutions didn't come until about 95 in Western Turkey. But that's an overstatement, and that you're kind of stretching it, because if you read Paul's letters, he was arrested, I can't remember exactly how many times, 3 or 4 times, flogged 3 or 4 times, thrown, in chains, all this. And so it wasn't unusual for these Christians, who were very different than the Roman people, to get arrested because the locals got upset with them, because if you converted a lot of people, they stopped buying the idols and they stopped going to the festivals, and it got into everybody's business. So he could just be referring to the routine abuse that you take for being a Christian in this relatively intolerant, forceful Roman Empire. So, and in that he says that it's written in Babylon, is what he says in the text. That's a code word for Rome. And so he's probably in Rome at the time. And all we don't have written records that he was executed there, but we just have the legends, which are long-term and probably accurate to a certain point. That it's actually formatted much more like Paul's letters. There's a greeting to whom it's directed. There's a closing at the end where you have, and this greeting's from Mark and Silvanus. Mark, whom he calls his son, Silvanus, and the sister, no doubt who the sister is, closes out the letter personally like Paul's letter did. So it looks much more like Paul's first century letters. And it's directed to the groups of believers in 5 provinces in Western Asia. I'll try to remember them: Bithynia, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, and Galatia. Galatia we're familiar with from Paul's letters, Paul's letter to Galatians. Asia, of course, is the small province around Troy, up where, if you remember your geography, the Black Sea comes out down through the Bosphorus. The Sea of Marmara is where Istanbul is right now. Used to be Constantinople. Then another passageway down through the Dardanelles. And as you're going down the passageway, Troy is to the east or the left as you're going down. And that's the province of Asia right there. And the name for that province has encompassed now the whole continent. But it was just a small province in the Roman Empire there. So this area where this is directed encompasses probably the western half or 2/3 of Asia Minor. So it's a relatively generalized letter, and it was designed to be distributed around the Christian church. With Paul's letters, they seem to have been written to individual situations, people, churches, and then the churches preserved them and passed them around. This was designed, they call them the letters to all Christians. It was designed to be shared with the whole Christian community. Interesting, most of those areas may have been converted by Paul. We don't really know how far inland he got in Asia Minor from the accounts in Acts. Probably not much. So it raises an interesting question of much of our history comes from Acts, which is relatively limited. There's no description in there how the church up in the Syrian area up above that got converted, how the Egyptian church, which was very large and very strong and still present, how it got started. We really don't know. And so it's our only account, but it's not a terribly complete one. So how those churches got started, you don't know. We don't even know how the church in Rome got started. There probably was a Jewish community there, whether it started out of the Jewish community or through Gentile conversions by someone other than Paul. The church was in existence when Paul was writing it in Romans and he had not been there. We just don't know. A lot of church history we just don't know. The theology in the letter is relatively straightforward first century Christian beliefs, believing in the redemption through Christ's sacrifice of his crucifixion and his death, and the power of baptism to bring us in this ritual of orientation and joining the church, kind of wash away our original sin through baptism. It does not get into certain Pauline stresses, what Paul stressed, which of course is salvation through faith and God's grace, which is a very specific Paul thing. It's not mentioned at all here. And therefore the abolition of the law. That's a tough one for a first century Jewish Christian to hear, because they had grown up where the law was almost worshiped more than the Lord, which is an issue inside. Some people have said inside Judaism even now, where you end up worshiping the law rather than the Lord. And its message is fairly basic, but it stresses that this person, Simon Peter, the Galilean, was an actual witness. to Jesus. He knew Jesus. He traveled with him. He was there at the Transfiguration. He was there at the crucifixion. He saw him after the resurrection, when he appeared at several times, including up in Galilee. So it's a very first-person account. And therefore it gets special prominence because he'd been there at Pentecost when Jesus first reappeared. It stresses the problems that are going to come, that they're going to have tension with the community, and that's typical. And in this type of situation where the church was not large and not prominent, of course you're going to have tension with the community. And that these are problems they need to overcome. They overcome them by adhering to the faith and by maintaining their holiness. They make the point over and over again, and you'll see it in all these letters, that you have to make a good impression on the Gentile community, so you have to live a good life. You can't be debauchering, you can't be excess drinking, you can't be doing all these evil things. You have to represent your faith well by your own personal behavior. So it's holiness is a word that's used here. But that's a good thing to remember. It's true of all of us. If we're going out and misbehaving all the time, cheating on business and other things like that, we're not going to portray the church well to the non-believers out there. It does stress, which is an interesting thing, it pops up in other first century writings, that Jesus was foreordained in his role, that this was designed from the beginning of time, that Jesus would be the Messiah and come down and save us. It doesn't get into the issues that we saw in Hebrews about whether Jesus was a created being, which is what John's Gospel says he was not, that he was divine, part of God from the very beginning, of the same substance as the God. But that's a minor role, and in the first century church wasn't struggling over that one, so I don't worry about it all that much. And the second chapter, you get into the new role that we have as Christians, and that we have become, as a Christian community, a replacement chosen community of believers, rather than the chosen community of the Hebrews, which was chosen by their ethnicity, not necessarily their believers. Like any group, they had good times in believing and bad times in believing, but this is we have replaced the chosen people as the chosen people of the Christian community. We need to represent ourselves well, our faith to outsiders. That's very, very common. That's how you bring people interest to the church, is you live your faith well. You love them and tolerate them and support them and try to bring them into the community. Very good advice here again, and you'll see it through all these letters. Be respectful of the Roman authorities. I mean, don't mess with them. The Christians were not trying to be social reformers. They were trying to be theological reformers to bring people into the faith. Don't mess with the Romans. The Romans could squash them if they wanted to. Then you have some routine, culturally conservative things. Slaves, be respectful of your masters. Again, they were not interested in starting the fight with slavery. The fight over slavery came out of the Christian community. It was Wilberforce and John Newton and a few people in Britain started the anti-slavery movement in the last part of the 18th century and up through the 19th, to our Civil War. But it was an issue that time had not come, even though it did come out of the church, anti-slavery movement. He was very traditional toward his roles for marriage and women. Women should be unadorned. Unadorned. And I would argue that everybody should be relatively unadorned in church. We should look decently, but we shouldn't get ourselves all jewelried up and showing ourselves off, because we're there to brag on the Lord, not to brag on ourselves. But it's an interesting, I don't find it all that it can be oppressive if you take it literally, but I think let's not worry about things like that. Husbands should be respectful of their wives, and Paul actually was better at this. Paul said, husbands, love your wives, which was an unusual thing to say in those days, because a lot of marriages were business transactions, family or relationship things, and weren't necessarily the love matches that we expect now. He, like many of the other epistle writers, he stresses that we must love each other. It's the only way to stand each other. We have to love each other and avoid fighting in the church. That's tough. Churches fight all the time, but it's really very destructive to do that. Gets into chapter 3. There's an unusual reference to Jesus as after his crucifixion, he went to preach to the spirits in prison. That's a quote from the thing. It's the only reference you find of this anywhere in the New Testament. And some people interpret it as saying Jesus descended into hell after his crucifixion and before his resurrection. I grew up in the old Southern Presbyterian Church, U.S. In our Apostles' Creed, we said he was crucified and dead and buried and descended into hell. Third day he rose again. The Methodist Church didn't use that. My wife grew up as a Methodist, and she never remembered hearing it. We don't use it now in the Apostles' Creed. But this is the only, it was in the Creed when I did it. The history of the Apostles' Creed is very unclear. You don't really know when it started, how it started, did one person started, did it grow up? You just don't know. There's just no record of it. But it was in the Creed for me to grow up, and I always thought it was kind of odd. Why would the divine have to go down to hell? In medieval times, it was a popular artist thing. I've seen a picture of they had Jesus going down to hell after his crucifixion, and at the resurrection, coming out of hell, leading Adam and Eve and all the other people who'd been condemned to hell until the Messiah had arrived. It's an interesting theological argument, but not one of much importance to me, but it just reminded me of that thing we used to say in the Apostles' Creed when I was a kid, which never made a lot of sense to me. Chapter 4, he again stresses the need to avoid the stresses of debauchery and poor behavior and other things like that. That's timely advice. Even now we need to do that. Then he stresses that the end is near. Remember what we've talked about. All these writers thought the time was going to end soon, that Jesus was going to come back in their lifetime. A parousia, it was called. They thought it was going to come back then, and he's telling everybody, it's coming, don't worry. People, because people would think, how am I going to put up this Roman Empire and these various corrupt officials and this and this and this? You could say the same thing now. How are we going to put up with this or this or this? Depends on what you like to put up with. But they thought the end was coming, and it clearly didn't come because we're here 2,000 years later. So my point is, I don't worry about the end of time. It'll come when it comes, and my job is to be a good Christian and behave myself until that time. So, and I'm not worried about the wicked being punished, which is what is assured here, wicked will be punished. That's God's problem. He can solve those things. I'm not about to do that. Now, he then closes in which he stresses his role as a true witness to Jesus and the resurrection. This is where he stresses it here in the 4th chapter. Even though it's important all the way through, this is a person who is speaking from his own experience, what he saw with his own eyes, what he felt physically and all that. And then he closes with the traditional Paul-type closing, greetings from his companions, John Mark, whom he describes as his son, Silvanus, who is the scribe, and the sister. It's not clear who the sister is. I don't really know. Maybe some people do know. So it's truly a letter in the style of Paul's letters. It's not a sermon like Hebrews was. It's not the polemic or diatribe like James was. James had a little greeting, but he just kind of went through all this. So it's traditionally a letter meant to reassure, maintain contact with these people, tell them to hang in there, to be good, keep the faith, things will work out, the Lord will provide. And it's much more in the format for a letter. So that's 1 Peter. We'll stop here. Next week we'll do both 2 Peter and Jude, both of which are apparently are later letters. Then the next week we'll cover John 1, 2, and 3. 2 and 3 are very, very short. And then we'll dive into everybody's favorite, not my favorite, Revelation. And I haven't decided how many lessons we're going to do on Revelation, but I do know the material we're going to study on. So this is Dr. Guthrie. I'll stop here. It's a pleasure.